Hello, everyone. My name is Kat Haylett, and I'm the events officer for Film Hub Southeast. For anyone who needs a visual description, I am a white woman with blonde hair wearing a grey t-shirt. You're about to watch a recording of a BFI Film Academy Lab session on using archive film to develop your filmmaking practice. This session covered how to use the archive to get inspiration for your filmmaking practice, alongside the process of accessing, researching, and booking archive materials, as well as insights into the way different archives operate. BFI Film Academy Labs are all about helping 16 to 25-year-olds break into the screen industries. These monthly practical sessions are led by industry professionals with a focus on explaining the specifics of working in film and television and developing your skills to become the best screen creative you can be. These labs are programmed across three strands: storytelling, business of film, and career ladder. We hope you enjoy this session. So now I'd love to introduce our guests. This session will be hosted by our young facilitators, Karine Davis and Layla Stewart. So Karine and Layla, would you like to just give me a quick intro as to who you are, starting with you, Karine?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kat, for introducing me. But yeah, my name is Kareni. I'm a recent graduate of Film and Screen Studies at UAL. I recently started a London-based film collective called Backronym Films, where we highlight and support marginalized and underrepresented filmmakers and cinephiles via production, events, and design. And also, I myself am a filmmaker and programmer. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, forgot. Visual description: I have short black hair, I'm a black woman, and I'm wearing a black jumper.
Lovely, thank you. Hello, for a visual description of me. My name is Layla Stewart. I am a tan woman. I have short black hair and I'm wearing a cream jumper. In regards to like a more description of myself, I'm also a graduate of the UAL Film and Screen Studies course. I'm an emerging filmmaker and also archivist. And yeah, I'm just very passionate towards film archiving.
Thanks so much, Karine and Layla. That's really great. We're also joined by our guest speakers for this session. We've got Chahine Fellahi, Theo Rollason, and Tabitha Carless-Frost, who are all filmmakers who have and continue to work with archives in various ways in their filmmaking practice. So what we'll do now is that each of those filmmakers will introduce themselves with a brief summary of their background and how they've worked with archive film. So we'll start with Shaheen and then move to Theo and then finally Tabitha. And then after you've introduced yourselves, Karini and Layla, you can just launch straight into asking some questions. So over to you, Shaheen, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thanks, Kat, and thank you, Layla and Karina. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you guys today. So my name is Chahine. For a visual description of myself, I am an Arab woman with pale skin and dark hair, and I'm wearing a striped shirt. I am an artist filmmaker and a facilitator, originally from Casablanca, Morocco. I basically work at the intersection of film, art, but also participatory art. So I develop both my personal projects, but I also develop a lot of projects in collaboration with different community groups. I was actually originally trained as a documentary filmmaker, so I kind of shifted slightly towards a different direction, working with a more like, experimental or abstract approach to filmmaking, but also working with spatial installations and projection works, etc. In terms of my work is often centered around or informed by media archaeology, which means it's basically the history of media and its evolution. So I do spend a lot of time researching like historical forms of media, and I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to these things. But yeah, I just love experimenting also with different image making techniques inspired by early optical media like chronophotography or camera obscuras, but also different like analog film processes and projection formats, which I use both in my filmmaking work, but also in my facilitation work. So that's how I ended up running the Wonder Club, which is a program of monthly workshops for young people happening at Hove Museum in Hove, so near Brighton, where we explore the history of early film and optical media in Brighton and Hove.
Hi everyone, my name's Theo. For visual description, I'm a white person in my late 20s with short brown hair, and I'm wearing a big brown jumper. And yeah, a bit about myself. I came into film quite recently, I guess. I didn't study film, but I wrote about film for some years. And yeah, and in my main job, I'm an archivist for an artist's estate. So that involves working with film in a more kind of archival, strictly archival sense, as well as like other parts of archive. And Tabby and I made our first fiction short film with BFI NETWORK that premiered this year, and I've been working on a feature documentary project that is ongoing and hopefully will be finished by the end of the year.
Nice, thanks guys. I'm Tabby. I'm really glad to be here and hear more about everything that's going on within archives. As a visual descriptor, I am a blonde person in my now late 20s with blonde eyebrows and a black shirt. As Theo said, I'm also a filmmaker with Theo. We've made one narrative feature short film that uses archive in a way that interacts more with my background as a writer. So I'm doing my PhD at the moment in creative writing, and a lot of what I focus on is different kind of silenced histories and how both landscape and media, so film in our film, can kind of like layer pasts over itself. And it's a way that kind of like is about like digging back and finding out what these hidden pasts are living like below the surface. But yes, archive, it's the short film that's my main link to like physical film archive. But yeah, my work works with all other kinds of archive, including like lots of medical humanities based things, which involve kind of going back through official documents of different medical institutions and thinking about what that means for individual agency for people throughout history. Yeah.
I guess just to start off the conversation, so Layla and I will both be facilitating, and we'll be jumping back and forth just to kind of elicit a nice free-flowing conversation. So I will pass it off to Layla with the very first question.
Lovely, thank you. So yes, for Theo and Tabby, to begin with, you mentioned a little before Out of the Peats being your short film. It's in collaboration with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust. I was just wondering, how did this partnership come about? Creatively, how did you find discussing themes of climate change and peat bog conservation with the archive? How did that come about, really?
So, so just so everyone knows, like I wrote the script and then we co-directed together. So I think some of the early images that I had for the film, to give a brief synopsis of the film, it is a what you call an eco-horror that engages with the traces that are left of extraction in the landscape, specifically in peatland and wetland landscapes in Lancashire, hence the Lancashire Wildlife Trust connection. It started out with us avidly looking for a location that was going to be, you know, reachable and doable, that also genuinely had peatlands that need restoring. And I have a family connection to Lancashire, so it kind of made sense. sadly, there's only about 3 peatlands that are viable to use in Lancashire. Over 80% of the UK's peatlands have kind of basically been killed, or they're on the borderlands between life and death. They're trying to be pulled back into life. But yeah, so we approached the Lancashire Wildlife Trust and kind of gave them a little flavour of like what we were imagining for the film, and we got put in contact with someone called Jenny, who was the communications officer for the project and who managed lots of different areas. And basically from the summer that we got, probably like a month after getting the funding confirmed, not receiving the funding from the BFI, but getting the kind of go ahead, we started a collaboration process with her. And I found it really easy to talk to most of the Wildlife Trust people about archive and land. They come at it from a very different perspective of kind of drawing your attention to the kind of like the daily politics of managing landscape like that. You know, they were talking a lot about the kind of relations they had to have with the farm owners in adjacent fields, that kind of put a very different perspective on how I was imagining you know, like a desolate peatland, like not having neighbors and what these kind of things, like in modern day, like there is a lot of competing neighbors and people who want to have claims on different areas of land. Yeah, do you want to say more?
Yeah, so and then there was always going to be a kind of archival component in the script. So the film it's about bog bodies preserved in peat, which is these kind of amazing historical phenomenon. And I think partly it's a narrative film, but it's quite experimental in that there's one character and there's no dialogue. And Tabby had given me quite a good idea of this character, who this character is. But the script doesn't really tell you who that person is. And I think using archive partly was a way of kind of expressing this idea that the character we're following is someone who's a kind of someone who puts himself in a kind of gets into research holes, maybe like against their will, which is definitely how me and Tabby work.
Yeah, when you start researching something to a point where you're a bit, you know, when you're like getting sucked into the whole of the archive and there's just so much to look at. And yeah, so it kind of helped characterize our main character as well, where there might have been lacking, you know, it's quite hard to do that through non-dialogue films.
Yeah, and then I think also just like really on a more obvious level, it was like about getting this conversation with history going. There's the history of bog bodies in our film, but also the history of the destruction of the peatlands, and then also kind of the history of the film material itself. That was always kind of in there in the script. So yeah, I mean, we can talk more about specific bits.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. I think, yeah, there's something so apt about kind of the archive, or to archive things. It lends so well in like an ecological horror, I suppose. Yeah, I was going to ask you, how did you use the archival footage to influence sort of your storytelling? And yeah, you answered that clearly with character-based roles. That's brilliant. Thank you. Passing it on to Krenny now.
Yeah, no. I was just going to ask more specifically kind of about your journey into finding the archival footage. So it's clear that you guys already had that in mind when you were creating, as opposed to kind of that coming later down the line. So I'd like to ask, what was the journey like in selecting the archival footage? What was the process like in gaining the rights to use it as well?
Yeah, it was quite difficult, to be honest.
Shall I say what? So in the script, the kind of specifics of archive, as I suggested it, was we used the archival footage in the end, and as I wrote it in the script, is a kind of almost like an affront. It's like a flashes of like archive images of bog bodies, and then we move into some I think as I wrote it, it was like various extraction of the land historically, you know, something kind of quite general, which left open some big questions about what we were going to put in there. We knew the subject was going to be, we needed extraction in the land in bogs, but that was kind of the starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We were shooting on 16mm film, and the film was kind of about the kind of weird parallels. I mean, behind the scenes, it was about the weird parallels between photochemical film and peat bogs, and how they actually have weird similarities about the way that, processes of like preservation and degradation. And we felt like that was in dialogue. All of which is to say that kind of having material that looked digital was kind of an option we like talked about earlier, and then said, actually, we don't really want to break that illusion. So I think like when you're looking through for archive, most people, the first thing they do is go to the internet. And a lot of the film we were seeing there had been kind of mediated, through being scanned at low resolution, or being digitized badly, or kind of copied a lot, or upscaled in some cases. And I think, and loads of the stuff also was like, so we were kind of looking for stuff that kind of get probably pre-1960. And ideally black and white. And a lot of the quality of the stuff was very bad, which I think in some films that really wouldn't matter at all. But for us, I think it did, just because we wanted to kind of have that continuity between the film that we were shooting on 16mm and then the film that you were seeing when we go into the archive bit. So that massively narrowed what we could use, because suddenly it was films that were digitized, available in high definition, had originally been shot on 35 or 16mm. So that was a kind of like narrowed the pool. And then we were kind of going through, we started, as I think most people do, by just kind of like looking on YouTube, and less so Vimeo, and kind of starting with very broadly kind of what kind of things are out there.
I feel like in the edit process, you also, with the editor, kind of put in some lower res, just kind of some stand-in stuff before we could find the exact perfect things that we really wanted to, track down.
Yeah, and I think we were trying to figure out like, okay, what kind of content do we want to be showing, but also, like trying to figure out with kind of like pre-edits what the rhythm of that moment in the film will be. So it's about a minute in the middle of the film where the action just stops and it goes into almost. It's kind of like a slideshow almost, but with moving image, and then it builds up a rhythm.
So we have, as a pre to the archival section, it's when our excavator character is digging into the peat for the first time. So we wanted something that was like, with every dig, we kind of go through this slideshow of images, and then it continues.
Yeah. And yeah, I think like, so yeah, we started with like YouTube and stuff, and then we were kind of going into the BFI's archive, having looked through their stuff, looking at regional archives in areas that have peatlands. So we were looking at the Northwest Film Archive and the Irish Film Institute, which actually was where we came across the footage that we wanted to use, or a large proportion of the footage we wanted to use. So then what happened after that was we found this stuff that we thought, oh my God, this is it. This is perfect. There was a kind of watermarked version available, and we downloaded that and did some kind of experimenting and thought, okay, this is kind of...
It was beautiful as well, 1920s?
It was shot in the 1920s. Ireland's famous for its peat bogs. And while we were looking originally for stuff in Lancashire, and then we kind of thought, actually, it's more important that we get footage that works in the context of a film than like being true to the location. It's not a documentary, and we weren't going to get too like fussy about that. So we got immediately quite attached to this film, which was probably not a great idea, because then we got in touch with the Irish Film Institute and said, hey, you've got this great footage, we'd love to license it. And they said, great, this footage is through British Pathé. Which, if you don't know, is like a large film archive.
They own lots of things.
Yeah, they own a huge amount of archive film. But like a lot of these big archival companies, they are very expensive.
I think we originally budgeted like
we originally budgeted like
£400
a
or
few
something.
£100s in our budget for archive film, and they were asking for a lot of money. So I can go into this more or we can pause on that.
I mean, I think you definitely could, but I would say, kind of going back to, I know you guys had mentioned earlier as well that your first time, like this is your first film together. Um, I guess kind of a general question is, what was that experience like? Not only deciding to use archival footage, but making the film with that in mind. I understand finding footage is also very expensive. I've had my fair share of experiences in that regard. But yeah, what was, I guess, definitely, I would love to know more about your experience, just kind of from beginning to end, from conception to execution, as this was your first film together. What was that like?
I think from the beginning of writing it, the first little kind of beginnings of it was Theo gave me a really good essay by Lyrical Nitrate.
Yeah, it was about the film Lyrical Nitrate.
Yeah, by is it Gigi Huberman?
I can't remember who wrote the article.
I will double check in a minute. But essentially it was kind of exploring the ideas of kind of the beauty or the kind of strange power of archival degradation, but also like how much of a problem this is in the way that I kind of never really even thought of it. But also in so there's nitrate film, which is the kind of very early film stock, extremely flammable, not very much of it around now. And then after that, there's celluloid in kind of various iterations. But essentially, I was reading this essay, and so much I'd been also reading stuff about bog bodies and preservation and landscape and lots of Seamus Heaney's poetry, and kind of came across this idea of like the landscape as archive, and thinking about, I don't know, that was like the kernel. And then almost, to be honest, there was a kind of motion of fitting a narrative around that. So archive has kind of been at the heart since the beginning, but I think it also introduced a really interesting element of kind of chance or kind of randomness, or like there was a little bit in the film that I always knew that we couldn't quite control because it would be hinged on that archival piece. Yeah, that's my
and I think like creatively it was quite interesting because we were shooting on a pretty tight budget. I think especially because we were shooting on film, which was a choice.
Yeah.
But it like costs go up a lot. And
that's first time filmmaker stuff, because I was so naive that I was like, yeah, of course we can shoot on film. It's fine. Yeah.
But it was pretty tight budget, and like we weren't going to be able to like shoot loads of material, so it was like scripted incredibly tightly, and like Tabby storyboarded it amazingly, and we basically just shot the storyboard exactly as Tabby drew it, and there was a lot of room for creative thinking before the shoot, but on the shoot it was like
we had 2 days. It was like we have a limited amount of stock.
Yeah,
every little bit has to be.
And so it was nice because then the archive section became it became its kind of way of working a bit more creatively and a bit more like we were discovering it as we were doing it. The edit itself was very we were basically just like editing. It was just like this take or this take. It wasn't like
we had a quite strong route map, so it was just like slowing things in.
Whereas the archive section, it was like we would kind of like try things out and experiment a bit more, and we, especially when we didn't quite know what footage we were using, it was like, does this kind of thing work? And a lot of the time it was no, it doesn't work. But it was like really
also the surprises of the things that you'd find in the archive footage, like going back to the Pathé stock that we used, the 1920s one in Ireland, there's some, like, we were kind of just looking for something to do with digging, peatlands, something that evoked the idea of like kind of layers of the past. There were some sections of it that had like an incredible kind of like, I don't know, anthropological lens of like different people's lives in the 1920s in Ireland, rural, that I'd never seen before. And it kind of like made me think, I want to license the rest of the stock to kind of go into it and like look at the rest of the things that are here.
Yeah, and I think the biggest surprise from creatively, I think, from using that bit of archive footage was that originally towards the end of the film, there was kind of meant to be like an encounter with the archive material in the diegesices of the film. And this was going to be a kind of just, we were going to project onto smoke the archive material that we got, like then smoke. It quickly became apparent that we wouldn't be able to do that just because you need to be in like pitch black dark to do that, and just like lighting it would be a nightmare and not really doable on our budget.
First attempted to do it on the bog,
Yeah,
which doesn't work.
but then it kind of, we then were looking back at the material we got, and we were going, okay, there's all these bits where the people are looking at the camera, you know, they're being filmed as portraits, people who were like working on the peat bogs. Suddenly this thing that we'd kind of been saying, oh, we can't use those shots because you know, that's kind of like breaking the fourth wall too much. We've suddenly like, wait, no, we should be using those shots. They're going to create something really interesting in I don't know, this idea of like looking back to the past and being looked back at, and that
confrontation
kind of became like this moment towards the end of the film that we decided quite late on, and I think it worked quite well.
I think personally it made the film.
Yeah, and I think it kind of like at a point in the edit we were like, maybe this isn't going to work, and then suddenly we put that in, and it was like, oh, I think this is kind of like this is kind of like actually rounded off all these ideas that we had kind of floating around, and suddenly it was like, okay, like looking a bit deeper into the archive we already had, and suddenly yeah, like
gave a human face to the past in a way that I don't think we'd planned, and it was so nice to be surprised by that, like, you know, really characterful intrusion. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you so much. I think, yeah, that's a brilliant answer. To Chahine, I have a few questions for you and for the Wonder Club program. I was just wondering, with such a vast array of projects and it's intersecting with analog and digital tools, how did the program first come about, I suppose?
Yeah, so just to give you a bit of context about the program, it's actually part of a wider project called Days of Wonder, which is a kind of broader program of exhibition, events, and residencies that happen in at Hove Museum. And this project is developed by two organizations based in Brighton. So you got Video Club and then Corridor. And yeah, so the Wonder Club is basically one of the youth strands of the program, which I've been running now for a year and a half. And basically every month we meet up with a group of young people. The group stays the same, like every 6 months, and we engage with the film and media collection that's held by the museum. The collection is actually part of the Barnes Brothers collection, which used to be located in Cornwall, and is now shared between the Hove Museum, but also the Cinema Museum in Turin. And I actually went to the Cinema Museum in Turin as a kid, and that kind of started my obsession with this whole thing. So it was a bit crazy to kind of end up, you know, like working and like responding to like this same collection. And yeah, so in the collection you've got both the film archive, which is also held by the Southeast Screen Archive. I don't exactly know like how the kind of museum and the Southeast Screen Archive kind of work out the rights, but we've got access to all the films. And then there's also all sorts of equipment like early film cameras and projectors, animation devices like Zoetrope, etc., but also a lot of archival documents and ephemera like film programs and working documents, photographs, etc. So it's a really, I mean, amazing archive, really. And with the group, basically what we do is that we watch films, we analyze them, we experiment with kind of processes that are inspired by early film techniques or even animation. But also, and mostly, we create new works in response to the film archive. And because I've been doing it with different groups, so we experimented with lots of different approaches to creating this new work. So sometimes we re-edit films from the archive, but we've also completely deconstructed them, like reprinted them, painted over them, turned them into frame by frame animations. And more recently, actually, one experience that was really interesting was that I discovered that there was this catalog of lost films. But the only thing that had survived was some working documents and director's notes and some like synopsis from this catalog of films by James Williamson. So like late 1900s, early 20th century. And we remade one of those films, which was an amazing experience, and also kind of really opened up a lot of conversations about like the fragility of archives as well. Like Tabby, you were talking about kind of also like the kind of material like preservation or absence of those films that because of at the time they didn't necessarily have the technology to like preserve them, they just disappeared. And yeah, so it's a super interesting program, and the fact that we create always as a group means that there's a lot of different creative voices, a lot of interpretation, perspectives on the material, which really shows kind of how endless the potential is in like activating the archive.
That's actually really cool, especially like for young people to learn about the archive. I think, was it Tabby that was mentioning kind of your school experience? Like that's actually important for young people to know kind of about their past. And so I guess a follow-up question to that is, why do you believe, especially through Wonder Club and also through Out of the Peat, like why is it important to explore not only the archive but to teach archival methods of filmmaking?
Well, it's interesting because I'm often asked, whether how challenging it is to work with like young people in like early film, and actually, in the end, it's not much challenging at all, because a lot of the language that was developed at the time, both like visual storytelling language, is actually very similar to the way that kind of contemporary like digital media practice is used today, with like GIFs. So before, they used to have these like animation loops or like micro narratives and things like that. But yeah, so I think creating that bridge is very important, but also kind of looking at early methods of filmmaking. They're really interesting to teach, because when you come back to the very basic mechanisms of film, so time, light, movement, the frame, the cut, when you basically strip film back to its kind of primal like components, you realize how powerful like these elements are, and also how much they inform our creative practices today. And then another important thing is to also give context to the media and film technologies that we use, because often we use them, and it's not the case just for young people, but for everyone, but we don't know where they came from, how they came about. So with projects with the Wonder Club, what's interesting is to not just teach the techniques, but also reflect on the cultural, political, the historical context in which they emerged, but also how they evolved over time, and how they became the technologies that we use today, basically. And yeah, and for me also, so that's another thing that's like more of like observation, like I feel like today, with the kind of culture of like constant like innovation, like what's the next thing, there's a lot of like extinction of knowledge, and in a way I see like the history of like media evolution is kind of similar to like natural history, where you have all these like specimens and you have like their evolution and stuff, but basically there's a lot of things that are disappearing, that are becoming extinct. And so for me, it's even more important to kind of preserve as much as we can, and also keep the transmission going.
Absolutely. And I think kind of conscious of time, my final question to everyone, and Chahine, you go first. Based on all of your experiences, why should young filmmakers explore using the archive in their creative practice? Do you have any advice for young filmmakers who want to use the archive in their short films or in their moving image works? And yeah, Chahine.
Well, why? It's hard to like boil it down to like one answer, or to so many reasons. you would use archival, but also it depends like what you want to do with it. Like, are you using it to critique it? Are you using it as like evidence for something? Are you using it to kind of preserve or like reactivate like an invisible history? And for me, what's interesting with archives is that they are alive. So they're not like just like this dead thing, like frozen in time. And whenever we recontextualize them, whenever we like transform them, we reuse them, there's always the kind of potential to like generate or uncover like hidden meaning and stories within them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd kind of echo that. I'd say like I think we have this conception of the past, and I think maybe even like especially the moving image and its history as like I don't know, kind of a set of things that have already been decided. And I think like using archive, you can kind of find out that things have been quite well for one thing, like quite ideologically narrativized, and you can go back and kind of reassess that. And I mean, like I'm working on a documentary project at the moment, and I think that's about like I guess early 90s gay culture in Britain. And I think like when I was first like looking at stuff there, there's in even documentaries that have already been made, there's kind of one set of archive images that I associated with that period. But the more digging I've done, the more I've realized that actually there's so much more than that. And there's lots of reasons for that. And it's not all kind of dubious ideological ones, but it's really interesting to see like, okay, there is actually value in like going back and making a documentary using archive from 30, 35 years ago, because that story I guess that isn't just like one story. There's like so many stories, and just because it's in the past, like it doesn't mean that it's kind of lost its relevance. And actually some things which, I mean, I think the thing that I'm working on now, which probably seemed less relevant in 1990, feels more relevant now. So, and that's like often like more and more true the further back you go.
Yeah, I feel like especially young people, like active interrogation and engagement creatively with the past in a way that they can think, as soon as you start applying creative tools to something like archive, I think, which feels for some people outside of, like for me before I even got into film, felt like a kind of a history that had been told. It was again, yeah, very fixed. As soon as you start kind of applying the creative freedoms that you might apply, as for us in like narrative, it kind of engaged my mind more critically, I think, to think about how these narratives are constructed and how a certain sleight of hand with editing, and like it just kind of encouraged a media literacy that I think probably would be very important to be like accessible from a younger age. I would have been happy to have this at a younger age.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know if we have time for one more question, Kat and Lily, or if we are ready to jump into audience questions.
Okay, definitely continue. We've got plenty of time, don't worry.
Okay. All right, lovely. I do just have one more question, and then we will. I'll pass it back to Kat to jump into audience questions. In terms of, I think it's quite interesting because Tabby and Theo, your film is using archival in kind of a narrative way, and then Chahine, your individual work as well as your work with the Wonder Club project might use in more of a documentary way. So again, to all of you, have you found that audiences are more responsive to the use of archival footage when it's incorporated into a fictional narrative rather than a documentary? Like, why or why not? Anyone can go first.
I think something that I think archival footage, possibly people are more surprised to see it in narrative. I think there's a bit more of a script that people, or at least I as well, I think people I've talked to who, you watch a documentary, you see archival footage as kind of this evidence that's being supplied to kind of, back up a documentary maker's point. I don't think that's the case across like a lot of creative documentary at all. And I certainly don't think it's the case for narrative film either. I think there's so much more creative ways to use archive that interrogate the idea of storytelling and kind of collapsing those boundaries between fiction and non-fiction, and kind of, I don't know, like troubling that space between the two.
For me, it's very hard to say because also I feel like the works that we've been making through the Wonder Club, also things that I like, personal projects that I've done which use archive, whether it's like institutional archives or like personal, like family archives, I can't really categorize them in either documentary or fiction. So I can't say for sure like what for me, like the response or the engagement of the public really depends on how the archival material is used, and also how it's, especially how it's like activated.
Thank you all very much for answering our questions. Now Kat, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we've got a few through. I do feel like we could just continue this conversation for absolutely hours. It's so fascinating. So thank you so much for all of your insights. The first question we have, you've already touched a little bit upon the process of licensing for archival footage, but could you maybe go into it from a very basic point of view for someone who's never sought a license for archival footage before? Where would someone start and what do they need to know? Maybe we can start with you, Chahine.
Well, for me, for this particular project, it was a bit different because I was kind of invited to come and work on a collection, so I already had access to most things, although still have to get agreements on like how it is used. So for example, if we were to like create a work and then we wanted to show it on say as part of a screening or something, I would have to kind of notify the museum and the archive. But how I would go about it, I would simply like, if it's like an institutional archive or even a community archive, or like a specific collection, I would just reach out directly to these people. That's what I did for my student film. I used archive from the Cinematheque of Tangier, and I just contacted them directly. And then you just get like a license agreement. Some of them, I was lucky that a lot of archives let me use their footage for free because I was using it in a context that was non-profit or educational. For commercial licenses, it's different. And then but it's also like what kind of archive are you using, because there's also like family or like personal archives which might not have like copyright status, but I would say the best practice would still be to kind of draw up like a licensing agreement with the person who like owns this archive, and kind of define the terms of how you're going to be using it. And then for more like internet stuff or like found footage, which something I use a lot, like I love collecting like more like physical found footage, so like buying stuff on eBay and stuff like this. And then there's obviously lots of things on the internet, so that's the kind of trickiest one, because you really have to like track where, like who owns it, and then also think, how are you using it. So there's a thing that's called fair use in the UK, and also I think it's also in the US, but there's a lot of like blurred lines, and I think you just have to do like a lot of research to kind of make sure that you're using it in like a proper way, or getting the agreement that you can, the permit that you can use it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we did with Out of the Peat was almost like the most kind of conventional institutional way of doing archive, and that's partly because of the requirements that we had with BFI Network and our funding. So that was like we went to this very big archive, and they have, you say we want to use the film for, with them, they divide it into country or territory, and then the amount of time you want to have the license for, and what else? And how much footage you're using. So, and with the BFI, they said that we had to essentially own the footage, so we had to be able to use it globally in perpetuity, because that would allow us to show it wherever we wanted, put it online eventually if we wanted to, which I don't think we would have done.
I think as first-time filmmakers, if I was working on a super limited budget, I wouldn't. But this did mean that we kind of have, as you said, we do we own the footage now.
We own
our iteration of the footage.
But yeah, so like with that, it was like that, and it was quite difficult there because we're making a short film that was going to make £0 in total, but
not profit.
Yeah, but it's then in their eyes they were saying it's a commercial film because you're not students, or you're not you make it for purely educational reasons. So as soon as you're entering into festivals, some companies like that say it's a commercial project. So that that's a bit tricky. But then there are definitely other ways of doing it, and much less formal ways of doing it as well. And the documentary I'm working at the moment, a lot of it has just been emailing people and saying, hey, I've seen this piece of footage, or even I've heard you've got some videotapes. Can we come and, do you want to meet for a coffee, talk about that? And then with those kind of things, that's a completely different thing, because a lot of the time, you'll be getting them kind of excited about the project and they'll be interested in what you're doing. And a lot of time they'll just say, yeah, you can have this, or have it for a small fee for whatever. So that's completely different.
There's space for negotiation within those.
But it always just starts with, I guess, an email of intent. And we also had some resistance, because this is quite interesting. But when we were looking for peat cutting footage, actually for photos for our film, we got in touch with a few personal archives of people who'd worked as peat cutters in the 60s, 70s, and said, hey, we're making this film and we kind of want to have have some footage that shows the labor that went into this peat cutting. And we had a few people who kind of basically said, we don't want anything to do with it because we're worried that you're gonna use this in ways that we don't want. And I think in some cases, you can kind of go back and reassure someone or whatever, but in those cases they got a bit spooked. So that does happen as well. And other things, we approached them and then they asked for just absolutely ridiculous fees that we were like, there's no way we can do that.
That's great. We had quite a few questions about where you can find archival footage to use cheaply or for free. So I feel like you've both touched on that as well, which is really helpful, I'm sure, for anyone trying to make a short film on a micro budget. We also had a question about what the responsibility might be from the filmmaker who's using archival film. So I guess I would interpret that to take ethical considerations when using this. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, both hypothetically and also maybe in your own experience as well. Shall we start with you, Theo and Tabby?
Yeah, sure. So I guess kind of jumping off the back of what we were just saying, that kind of there is a lot of negotiation within using archive film, because it is essentially, it's film that you've not shot. You're kind of approaching it as found footage, but it's owned and it's got someone's histories attached to it, and it's also editing, as I've said before, will specifically and very strongly change meaning in it often, and how you present something. So I think there is a big responsibility for the filmmaker to kind of be aware of how the even if it's not the official owners of the archive, but people who might be implicated in it might interpret and kind of read the film if you're going ahead with it. I think again, also, yeah, with personal archives, I'm having a kind of a similar situation, but not specifically archival film. I'm having it with a kind of a personal family archive for a writing project, which, you know, it's just lots of discussions. I think if you've got any background or knowledge of like drawing up any licensing agreements or kind of, you know, things that kind of make the discussion feel very like plain, and you plain speaking, you say exactly what you're using something for, and then you go to the person or the group or the community that owns the rights to these things, and you ask them, and you respect their decision if they say it's not for us, because there will be other things, there will be other more or just different pieces of archive to use that have communities who are interested.
Yeah, I think it's always good to be like really upfront about how you're planning on using archive, and if that changes, like kind of letting people know, because the last thing you want is to make something, think it's all finished, and then have someone take issue with the film, and you realize that actually they have grounds for doing that. Yeah, I mean, like, you know, I think like I'm not sure I would make too much of a distinction between like, yeah, the ethics of using archive and using any other film. It's like it is going to be manipulative, and I think you have to be transparent about that to some extent in your work. And like even, you know, it doesn't have to be like too heavy-handed, but I think it's kind of good to kind of remind everyone that you can't help distorting, you know, a film which is already a distortion of real life, and just, yeah, having that. I mean, I think in Out of the Peat, that's kind of implied by the way that we use the footage to some extent. And yeah, other documentaries will do that more or less explicitly.
Yeah, well, I would completely agree with Tabby and Theo, and like I think the transparency is like really key in how you intend to use the footage, like aside from all the more like just like obtaining like permission, and even when they are informal archive, I think it is important to just kind of formalize this and, you know, just like write it down. But yeah, other than that, I think also another kind of ethical consideration when it comes to like working with archives is like maybe, you know, like thinking about like context where they were made, like where they're from, and also often there is like the question of representation. So for example, with like the early film archive that I've been working with the Wonder Club, well, it's a very, you know, like straight white male gaze. So, you know, how do we also reflect on that? What, you know, what's missing from the archive? Like who is missing? From like what voices are silenced? So how, you know, for me, it's also like part of our responsibility as filmmakers to also like consider that. And actually, one of the first projects that I did, working with archive, was made by this Italian man, like industrial, who was traveling around Morocco and like filming around like the 1930s, 1940s, filming women, like Moroccan women. And I was a bit shocked by like the kind of violence of the gaze and how like kind of orientalizing it was and voyeuristic it was in a lot of ways, which is a kind of, you know, like classic trope of especially this era of just, you know, kind of documentary filmmaking around Morocco. And so what I did was like I distorted the footage so that actually you couldn't see like the faces of the women anymore, so that they would kind of escape this kind of scrutinizing gaze of the camera. So it's also, yeah, kind of thinking about that as well. But yeah.
I just also say there is like, I just thought of this now, but like that there is like an emerging ethical concern about AI and the archive, and I think it's like worth saying, because I've over the last few years I've seen a lot of, especially more kind of like big budget mainstream things that will upscale footage massively, or even like kind of add in bits of footage, or like, and I think like, I mean, I have my own views about that, and I mean, frankly, I don't think it's great as in terms of like truth claims for the archive, but like whatever people's stance on it is, I think it's important that like that is foregrounded, and that people kind of understand, because I almost feel like like a visible interruption into the archive, like Chahine was just describing, that that's immediately clear, like what processes are going in there if you're like obscuring someone's face. Whereas like if you're, I don't know, expanding an image to fit an aspect ratio, and a third of the screen is made up by artificial intelligence, that's a completely different thing. And as a viewer, you're not necessarily going to register that as AI gets better and better. So I think that is more and more like a big ethical concern for thinking about archive.
I think if it depends on where you stand within the manipulation. If you're like aware and you're privy to the kind of technologies at work, then great.
Yeah.
If you're not, then you're going to have the archive obscured in not productive ways.
Thank you both. That's really interesting to consider, and Chahine, especially your intervention. I think that's a really fascinating way to engage with it. We have another question, which is a bit more of a fun one. Could you talk about your favorite films that use archive footage? And maybe we can start with you, Chahine.
Well, one film that I actually watched at uni that really fascinated me is by this artist called Martin Arnold, who uses, I think he just uses some like old Hollywood films, but that he kind of reprints on film, and then like does all sorts of manipulations with like an optical printer, so like completely changes like the speed, but like he really works it like frame by frame, and it just makes this like really weird like mutant kind of form of the films, which I love, and almost kind of extracting a sort of like unconscious like within the film. So I do love like this kind of approach of like treating the archive as something that has kind of layers of like hidden like stuff within it that you can like dig out and kind of turn into this yeah
Yeah, I also love him and his work. I think my favorite is probably Peter Czachowski, who's similarly uses optical printers and like does interesting things with existing footage. So like it used to be more fiction film, but he more recently has kind of started using advertising and kind of weird commercial film. And I don't know, it's very interesting. But yeah, and then the one that was like a huge influence on our film was Bill Morrison, who
Probably specifically Decasia.
Yeah.
Who again kind of marshals the decay present within these archival images that he's found, and kind of dramatizes it as a character. There's kind of this kind of formlessness, like forming formlessness, as this like decay eats its way through this old celluloid, and it just kind of moves and distorts, and it kind of brings certain characters in these. I think there are some of them are from fiction films, some of them are kind of what do you call it, cinema of attractions type things. There's a whole range, but it's beautiful. There's this kind of like poeticism to the continuous shapes of the decay in the archive that I just think is wonderful.
Yeah, and I think like it with his film, it's all about like foregrounding how fragile film is, and it would be easy to say he's just kind of like he's not really doing much. He's just picking film and putting it together, and what's the use in that? But I think he does. It's much more subtle than that, and he does really interesting things. There's a great one that he made he remakes Frankenstein, but exclusively using very old film footage from like the 1890s to the 1920s, really, and it's great. It's so bonkers.
Amazing. Thank you for those insights. I'm sure people now will be able to add those to their Letterboxd watch lists by then. Um, Not to make you keep talking a lot more, Theo, but we had a question from someone who has asked about what pathways led you to end up working as an archivist. And I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be starting out very early in their film career. So yeah, maybe you could speak a little bit to that and how you got started on that.
I'm probably not the best person to ask because I did kind of get into it by accident. I mean, but well, yes and no. I mean, like I'm, I've like Chahine, I've been interested in media archaeology for a long time, and I think that that was kind of what got me interested in, yeah, like old film and materiality of film, especially. Um, but yeah, I started working for an artist estate, and because I had all of that knowledge, if not, I didn't have any practical experience with it really, but I just had the knowledge and like wanted to work with film and photo. And so kind of quickly into that job, that kind of became my job within their archive that was kind of emerging at that point. So yeah, I think, but so, I mean, you know, you can obviously get like an archival degree, but most people I know who work in archiving have just kind of got into like an arts institution, been really vocal about what they're interested in, have kind of, you know, like
Started off working in like charities and doing a lot of stuff to do with like
yeah,
images and
well,
their own.
yeah. So I guess I taught myself how to edit film while I was working in a completely different job in like communications for a charity. So it was kind of like a good skill to have for then doing, you know, a lot of like archival stuff where even if you're working with film or video, you end up doing most of it digitally. You know, you end up dealing with a lot of materials that have been digitized. But yeah, I can't give like too much more specific advice than that, other than most of my friends who do archive stuff have just kind of been enthusiastic about it and kind of managed to get there by sheer annoying persistence rather than like, yeah, finding any like one hack.
Yeah, I think it's the case for a lot of film careers, isn't it? People get there through all sorts of ways. But I mean, for any young people who want to get hands-on experience, Chahine, could you talk maybe a little bit about how people can get involved in Wonder Club? I know it's for younger people, so that might be helpful for anyone who's on the younger side to hear.
For sure. Well, we're actually going to do a new call for participation for the new phase, which is starting in April, I think. So the call should be already out now, and it's going to be on the Hove Museum Video Club website. So if you want to join us for the next rounds, we'll be very excited to have you. And also, yeah, for like opportunities for young people. So that's things like we try to also, you know, accompany young people in, like, so for example, there's one person who wants to like gain experience in like facilitating workshops. So I do kind of also help, like I also like offer like training or like volunteering, like work experiences. And whenever we do other events, we also like propose to any participant to join us as a volunteer. And yeah, so that's kind of how we like try to support young people.
That's great, a totally invaluable opportunity for anyone on the call. I'm definitely aware of time, so I'm just gonna pick up one final question from the Q&A and also add one of my own. From the Q&A, people are very keen to know where they can watch your work. So yeah, if you could each talk about where your work might be available to watch online or in upcoming events. And then my added question is, what are you working on at the moment? What exciting archival projects can we anticipate from all of you? Shall we start with you, Chahine?
Yeah, well, not a lot of my work is available online. I think some stuff might be on Vimeo, but I have shown stuff before in festivals. I don't have any upcoming screenings, but probably put it on my website, although I'm not the best person at communicating this kind of thing. And what I'm working on at the moment is actually a film, also using archive, which is a bit more autobiographical, where I'm tracing the female lineage in my family, and both kind of reflecting on like mother and daughter relationships, but also on the participation of the women in my family in the struggles against colonial occupation in Morocco in the 1940s and 1950s. So I've been using lots of cool family archives, both film, photographs, documents, also tons of objects that I've just gathered around my grandmother's house. So yeah, that's quite exciting project, and hopefully it will be finished this year. I hope so.
And Out of the Peat isn't available online yet,
but it will be screening at, let me remember, at Sunrise Festival in Lowestoft in May or June, May. At Trans Festival Stockholm at the end of this month.
It's playing in Chicago. In the odd chance anyone in this BFI call is from Chicago, it will have a live accompaniment, and we can't go because it's in Chicago. So
yeah,
someone should go.
But probably the best place to follow where the screenings are and bits and bobs. Someone just said, "I'll be flying to Chicago." Excellent. Is looking at our Instagram account for the film, which is Out of the Peat film. I'll put it in the chat now, just so people can have a look at it.
Hopefully it will have a bit of festival. It only premiered a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And I'm currently working on a documentary about Derek Jarman, the filmmaker, and his relationship with the gay rights protest group Outrage. And that is entirely made out of archival footage. And I'm doing my best to resist everyone telling me that I should do interviews and voiceover and going, no, it's all archive.
I've not got any film things coming up, but I am finishing, well, I've just started a big writing project that involves not archive, but it is historical. It involves some wax sculptures from the 18th century. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for watching this BFI Film Academy Lab session on using archive film to develop your filmmaking practice. If you would like to find out more about this session, you can visit our lab's webpage, which you can find in the video's YouTube description, and you can follow Film Academy on our social channels. Thank you so much, and see you next time.